Well, good evening. My name is Guy Forsythe. I live in Sedona, Arizona, and I have a ministry here called Crying Rocks Ministry, which is a creation science ministry. My wife is part of the ministry here. We moved here in 2003, asked God where we should go when I retired from teaching. He said, go to Sedona. And we asked, what are we going to do there? And he said, I'll let you know. And we're here for a while, and we moved here in June of 2003, and by around February of 2004, he put in my mind to start a creation science ministry. And so we have a newsletter that we put out to everybody in Sedona 4 times a year. I believe the last issue was number 86. So we mail out about 11,000 of these every 3 months and try to spread the gospel and some creation science to the people in Sedona. And you'll notice on the newsletter that I have there that in the green letters, it talks about uh, shows that have to do with the Coconino. And you can click on any of those on our website. Actually, excuse me, it's the red down below. You can click on any of those links on our homepage, and it will take you to the paper that it's talking about there. If you want to know more about the petrology of the Coconino, that's there. And what I'm going to be talking about, one of the things is the last item there, which is the parabolic recumbent folds. So I like to have scripture for what I'm doing, and what I like to use is Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him. Answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he may not be wise in his own eyes. And tonight, that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some of his statements and show that he's not being wise in some of the things he's saying. But we always do it with respect, with love, and with joy. We want to be friends with the people and convict them with our love for them. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the latest findings in the Coconino Formation. And this came about, my interest in the Coconino in 2010 when I found an unusual thing or structure geologically in the Coconino Formation. I emailed some photographs to John Whitmore, and the result was John and Paul Gardner and Ray Strom coming to my house to spend a couple of nights and go up and look at what I found in the Coconino, and we ended up with a research paper that got published. So I'm going to use some terms tonight. Creationist, I think you know what that is. In this case, it's a young earth creationist. And I'm going to talk about naturalist. I'm going to say, would the naturalists believe this or whatever? And a naturalist is an atheist who is a materialist who believes that all there is matter and energy in the laws of physics. And that person, that if he is a scientist, then I'm going to call him a naturalist, so that we have that down. Three kinds of rock: igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. And under the sedimentary, we have mudstone, limestone, and sandstone. And what we're going to talk about tonight is sandstone in the Coconino Formation. And why is the Coconino important? It's important because the naturalists basically made it important because they said, hey, this is deposited as sand dunes. It took 5 to 10 million years to blow in all that sand. The source is the Appalachian Mountains. It came across supposedly in rivers that crossed the continent, and then those dried out, and we had dry sand, and that got blown in by the wind. And that would take millions and millions of years, 5 to 10 million years, they say. And in fact, the Navajo, they say the same thing about it. And it's 2 to 3 times thicker than the Coconino. So this is a major battleground, because the question is, was the Coconino deposited in air, or was it deposited by water? The Coconino Formation covers the area you see here in yellow. And just 10 years ago, this area was probably 1/2 to 2/3 as large. We'll keep discovering more outcrops in various places that are coconino, and we can keep adding to the map. But you'll notice that it's, for example, in Arizona, it's called the Coconino, but in New Mexico, it's called the Glorieta sandstone. In Colorado, it's called the Lyons sandstone. And that happened because when they were first discovered, you know, it's back in the early 1900s, and somebody would find something and he'd write a paper on it, and it'd go into some obscure journal somewhere, and 100 people would read it and put it up on the shelf, and that was it. And then somebody else found the lions in Colorado and wrote a paper on it, and it went into a journal, and a few people read it, and it went up on the shelf. And you had all these different little formations. And with the naturalist philosophy or paradigm, this was really to be expected. With the advent of the internet, we started seeing that these were all connected. We could start sharing information easier, putting up maps, putting up photographs, and being able to show that all of these formations were actually the Coconino. Or it could be they're all the lions, whatever you want to call them. At the Grand Canyon, the Coconino is 65 to 600 feet thick. In Sedona, it's about 500 feet thick. And I've got a little arrows on there to show you what those layers are at the Grand Canyon and in Sedona. The Coconino is famous for being cross-bedded. You can see that the strata lines are angled. We call that angled the dip. And the angle is between the horizontal and the direction of the grain from horizontal. And it's typically around 20 degrees. And we see three different beds there. Notice the distinct, sharp horizontal line at the bottom and top of the beds. So we can see that something happened there. A bed gets deposited and then it stops, or something happens and a new bed comes in on top of that, and then another bed on top of that. And we're not going to get into the details of how all that happens, but in Arizona, the Coconino is famous for being cross-bedded. The other formations, they're flat-bedded for the most part. And here's an example of flat bedding. And it can be very difficult to determine exactly what to call a bed and what to not call a bed. It's actually kind of arbitrary at places. I've put the line at the bottom line here for a bed where where the red is on top of a white layer. So it looks like something happened there, and it's a different flow that made that top bed. And then at the very top, you'll see that the strata lines are just a little different. The way it's been eroded is a little different. So it looks like we have a separate bed there, but it can be very difficult to determine. But when you have cross bedding, it's pretty easy. And here in the Coconino, you can see where the beds occur, you have strata lines, but they seem to be thicker and deeper, more pronounced. So you can see them there. And also in this photograph, you can see that there's some flat bedding. The big knob that's in the upper left-hand corner, right in the middle of it, going through it, is an area of flat bedding. And that flat bedding is about 8 feet thick, something like that. And it's found all over Sedona. So Sedona has some unique characteristics in the Coconino. We'll be talking about them. And one of them is that we have the most flat bed of any place in the Coconino. And that particular bed can be found all over Sedona. Everywhere I've looked, you can find that flat bed. And that makes it kind of easy then to correlate the different exposures by using that flatbed to see how far up in the Coconino I am and what's going on. On the left is kind of the physics of laying down cross beds, and we're not going to dive into that too much, but you can notice that it talks about water velocity and water depth. And there is physics behind this, and a lot of that has been worked out. On the right is a chart from Glenn Vescher in a book that he wrote in 1990. And this was the first time that the Coconino was compared to underwater deposits. Of course, the Coconino was assumed to be a desert deposition rather than a water deposition, but Vischer looked at water crossbedding and looked at sand crossbedding. And when he charted out this, the grain size and the percents, he found that the Coconino looked more like an underwater deposit rather than an air deposit. And of course, his fellow naturalists discredited him. It wasn't a published paper, and accused creationists of taking him out of context. Of course, that kind of stuff goes back and forth all the time. But what we're going to look at tonight is 13 different reasons we know the Coconino is deposited in water. And we're going to start with some myths. And I want to talk first about deductive reasoning. Modern sand dunes dip at 29 to 31 degrees. Since the naturalists assumed that the Coconino was an ancient dune, you can find scores and scores of papers written over the time where they say the dip of the Coconino is 29 degrees. Now they haven't measured it. It just keeps getting repeated because that's the deductive reasoning. They assume that it was deposited in air, and therefore they come up with the conclusions that it was deposited in air. And they say that the dip is between 29 and 31 degrees. And by the way, you can tell which way the water or air is blowing by the dip of the sand, either one. So you can determine which way the flow was going, which is kind of neat that you can't do that with flatbed, but with crossbed, you can tell which way the flow was moving. In Wayne Rainey's book, Sedona Through Time, he talks about, we know that it's going to be that slope, and sure enough, the crossbeds and the Coconino are between 29 and 31 degrees. He says, we'll go up and we'll look at it. And he also talks about avalanching downhill. We're going to look at those later also. But he makes the statement that it was 29 to 30 degrees and that it can only happen when deposited by air. So I asked him, I happen to know Wayne, I wrote him an email because we were doing some measurements. And I said, Wayne, we're coming up with different slopes. Where do you find this place where they're all 29 to 31 degrees? And his response was, Blakey told me. Blakey was a professor at Northern Arizona University. Wayne was his student, and Blakey told him that it was 29 to 31 degrees. Now, you may think, well, really? That's it? But that's human nature. He had no reason to doubt Blakey. Blakey probably never measured it. Wayne admitted that he never measured it. When I told him I was getting different angles, he said, well, it must be because you don't know how to measure it. In fact, there was a paper published by a naturalist around 1990 in which he measured the Coconino dip, and he found it to average 20 degrees. And the team that I've been on also did some measurements, 214 of them, and we've done more since. And actually, the steepest we found now is one slope where we found it at 36 degrees. But you can see it's highly variable, but it averages 20. We found the same average as the naturalist had in the early 1990s. The funny thing is that it turns out that sand dunes vary quite a bit also, but they average more like 22 degrees. And there are two teams that have written papers comparing sand dunes to sand waves being deposited in water, sand dunes being deposited in air. And they say you can't just look at the slope. You've got to look at lots of other things to determine if it was deposited by water or by air. And so we're going to have 13 of them to look at. Just to give you an idea about underwater sand waves, this is in Long Island Sound. This is the bottom of the sound. And you can see all those sand waves, the whole bottom there just about is filled with sand waves. And there's a ship with an arrow pointing to it that's 240 feet long. So that gives you some scale for what we're talking here. So sand waves can cover a very large area. In fact, wherever the water can flow along there and shape it, you will get sand waves. And there's a pretty good current that goes through Long Island Sound. Now, the second myth is that the Coconino is well sorted. And sorting, you can see here we have a couple of photographs. The one on the left shows poor sorting. You've got all kinds of different sizes. The one on the right shows well sorted. They're all approximately the same size. And it would still be well sorted even if they were different size, but it transitioned, say, from top to bottom or bottom to top. They went from larger to smaller or from smaller to larger. That would still be well sorted. But the Coconino is not well sorted. When you look through it through a field glass, which is that little device in the center there, it magnifies by about a factor of 10. And you really can't see anything but the biggest grains. For example, in the upper left one there, if you look through a field glass, all you'll see is those real large grains. You will not see the small ones. It doesn't magnify enough. In this case, we've taken the rock, impregnated it with an epoxy, which is blue. So where you see blue in these, that is where the epoxy has been put in under pressure so that it can be cut and ground down to about 30 microns thick. And then you can actually shine a light through it and see what it looks like. And you can see that the Coconino is poorly sorted. You have all kinds of different sizes in there. The bottom right one begins to get kind of sorted. It's semi-sorted because the grains are all pretty much the same size. There's quite a bit of variation there, but still not bad. But the Coconino is poorly sorted. When sand is blown through air, it gets sorted because it gets picked up as the wind speed gets higher and higher. It picks up larger and larger grains. And as the wind speed dies down, it drops out the larger grains first, followed by smaller and smaller and smaller grains. So the sand dunes are well sorted. And that's what you'd expect in the Coconino, but it's not. The third myth is that the Coconino is well rounded. That would be expected. And through a field glass, it looks fairly well rounded. And that's to be expected because as these sand grains get blown through the air, it's expected that they'll hit each other and knock off corners and gradually round themselves off. But in fact, the Coconino grains are subangular. They're not well rounded at all. And the electron micrograph on the right shows the grains blown up quite large, and you can see that they are really quite not quite angular. All the angles there that you see on the different surfaces. Number 4, some Coconino is frosted. They contend that it's all frosted, and the reason for that is when you look through a field glass at the Coconino, they do look frosted because you see all these sparkles all over. And so, gee, it looks like it's frosted. Now, frosting occurs in one of two ways. You can use acid to etch it, and glass is made of silica, just like the sandstone is. So we can kind of look at one of those to see the effect. And I have some grains there in the center of Coconino, and you can see that they are frosted. They are not smooth surfaced. They've been etched by an acid. And you can see that on the left photograph there, the bottom left through the electron microscope. But we would expect the Coconino, if it was blown through the air, to be more like a sandblasting etching, where you would have very distinct scratches and very distinct pits caused by the grains running into each other. But only about 20% of the Coconino is etched that we found or frosted. and it looks like acid etching, not like sandblast type of etching. Number 5, on the right, you can see a slab of coconino. By the way, if you have flagstone around your house, there's a good chance it's coconino. It shaves off and splits off into real nice slabs. In the West, virtually all flagstone is coconino because it separates so well. But on the right, you can see some bumps in that slab. And the naturalist contends those are raindrops. But on the left, you can see what it looks like after a hard rain and what it looks like after a light rain. And I love the little dots that are made in the light rain because you kind of have a crater with a crater inside the crater. And I've actually found that those are taken in the Schnebly Hill Formation sandstone, where it's not hard. It's been eroded away. But I've actually found the same thing in one place in the Coconino. They look just like that after a rain. If you look on the right, you can see that the distribution of the so-called drops is not the same as we find in the sandstone on the left. We believe those are actually formed by air bubbles, that gases are being released from chemical reaction down in the earth, and they are bubbling up because the sediments are still very soft and they can bubble up through the sediments, and they get caught then. As the sediment hardens, they can only go so far and they get caught. And so I think what we're seeing there is the effect of bubbles. The 6th is vertebrate tracks. Throughout the Coconino, there are tracks like this. There's even one nice set in Sedona in the Schnebly Hill Formation, and they have the same characteristics. The one in the Sedona does not have one of the characteristics. They're actually at a pretty good straight line. But in the Coconino and everywhere, when you find trackways, critters tend to meander. But when we find trackways in the rock record, they're always in a straight line, or almost always in a straight line. And critters go in a straight line when they're running from something. So there's a good reason to think that whoever left these tracks in the Coconino was running from something. And a study was done looking closely at these footprints in various places. And you'll notice the long arrow shows the direction the tracks are going. The short arrow shows the direction the feet are pointing, which is kind of interesting. It looks like something is pushing this thing from the left, kind of like when an airplane lands in a steep crosswind and it comes in crooked, and as soon as it hits the pavement, the pilot straightens it back up again. These critters are running, trying to run straight uphill. Instead, they're getting pushed off to the right as they go up. And another interesting thing to note is that all of the footprints in the Coconino go straight uphill. They do not go sideways. There's one exception, one place where they found tracks that did not go straight uphill, and a paper was written about just that one set of tracks because that's so unusual. Just one of them. They go in the direction of travel. They always go uphill, which would seem to me what's happening is they are running to get to higher ground. So they're going straight uphill because they see this water coming in to get them. Another interesting thing about trackways that are found in any rock anywhere is, for example, near Sedona up in near the Grand Canyon, there is an area that just has thousands upon thousands of dinosaur tracks and not a single bone. If you want to find dinosaur bones, you have to go to a higher layer of strata. And that's true for most trackways. There are no bones in the Coconino. At least I'm not aware of any fossils that have been found in the Coconino, but there are lots of trackways. You have to go higher up in the geological record to find the critters that make the trackways. That makes sense from a creationist point of view and a Noah's flood point of view, because here's this creature running through wet mud, leaving footprints that immediately then get covered up and protected by a layer of sediment. If that was done in sand dunes, they would not be nearly as distinct. Even if the sand was kind of wet, they wouldn't be as distinct. And the wind would dry out the sand and then blow the tracks away. They would get covered up by more sand and you would never see them. Now let's look at some facts. These are things that the naturalists never talk about. For one reason, because they haven't really done a lot of research and are unaware of some of these. Even today, they're unaware of some of these. And a lot of times it's because they are intentionally ignorant. They don't want to know about it. But it's significant what we can find. So fact number 7 is clast. And a clast is nothing more than a big rock. And here you have a clast in the Coconino. It happens to be in a bed that is massive. And in geology talk, that means there's no stratolines. It doesn't mean it's big. It means no stratolines. So how does a big rock get in the middle of the Coconino? Wind cannot blow it in, but water could transport it in. Water has the power to do that. Dolomite. Dolomite in general is a huge, huge problem for the naturalist because throughout the geological record, we find layers of dolomite, some of them quite large. Here are 3 layers of dolomite, 4 layers, excuse me, in the Coconino with the 4 arrows there pointing to it. On the left side at the bottom, you see the green circle around a dolomite ooid that happened to get cut exactly in half by the process of making a thin section to view through the microscope. But all 4 of those are showing dolomite. And at the top is a map that shows the area that the dolomite is found in. Dolomite is a huge problem because the huge layers we find in the rock record, but today dolomite, if we can find it forming anywhere, it's an area of a few square feet because dolomite is a chemical reaction of magnesium with limestone. And it only can chemically react and make dolomite when the water temperature is well above 100 degrees. It is a marine deposit. The naturalists will agree to that. It's only found where it was deposited in water because it has to combine with the limestone, and that takes a very high temperature. The naturalists acknowledge that it takes a high temperature, but just consider it insignificant and, well, we just won't talk about it. Next, we have an injectite. So that white arrow is pointing to something that goes all the way up. You can see it goes vertically all the way up until it hits that flat surface at the top. That is actually the bedding plane between the Hermit and the Coconino at the Grand Canyon along the Bright Angel Trail. And that injectite is actually Coconino material down into a opening that occurred in the Hermit. Well, supposedly there's 10 million years between when the Hermit was deposited and when the Coconino was deposited. So how in the world did the Coconino fall down into the Hermit? Especially when you consider this was supposedly about 260 million years ago. And for that crack to form, well, it could happen in an earthquake, but the Bright Angel fault supposedly occurred 50 million years ago. So it couldn't happen, but the problem's even bigger. John Whitmore got published in Sedimentary Geology with a paper on these cracks. And of course, that was his one paper. Every creationist gets one paper. And then they find out, hey, that guy's a creationist. What are you doing publishing him? And that's the end of it. John will never be published in a secular journal again, no matter how good he does in his study. But he points out that there's evidence there that says that the sand-filled cracks formed before the Hermit and the Coconino were fully lithified. Lithified means hardened into rock. The lode cast lock features associated with the sand-filled cracks along the Hance Trail also suggest the Hermit was somewhat unlithified during crack filling, and there are small parts of Hermit within the sand-filled cracks that show the Hermit may have been at least partially lithified. So it's an argument that they were deposited about the same time, and they were deposited in water because they hadn't turned hard yet. Um, they hadn't had time to harden when this occurred, even though there's supposedly 5 to 10 million years between the two layers. The Hermit boundary. This is a photograph taken from Lippen Point. I have to use a telephoto because it's quite a ways away, probably a mile or so. But you can see at the bottom of this a sloped surface with Hermit in rocks, just tiny rocks. You can see that it's not a rock face, and it comes up and stops, and right where it stops is the bottom of the Coconino. And you have a thin layer of Coconino, and then you have a very thin layer of Hermit, and then you're back into Coconino the rest of the way up the photograph. How did Hermit get deposited after the Coconino started depositing? This is a major problem. It shouldn't be there. That should be solid Coconino. This is what avalanches look like on sand dunes. Wayne Rainey was talking about basically the wind blowing over the top peak of this, causing avalanches to come down. But the Coconino has no avalanches that look like this. Everything is just flat. So true avalanches are not found in the Coconino, which means it probably never was exposed to wind. The next item is calcite cement. These are 3 photographs taken on Bear Mountain. The one on the left is a general view of an area of calcite cemented material. On the right is a close-up, and on the bottom is a picture taken a little higher up, and you'll notice that it's red in the middle of the Coconino, and it's calcite cemented. When I've taken rock samples from the Coconino, in most places, you give it a firm tap and you get a nice little chunk that comes off. With this calcite is you beat on it with a hammer, many, many strokes as hard as you can, and finally something chips off. It's very, very hard. How would you get localized calcite cement in the middle of a sand dune? You can't. But if water was flowing and it happened to go through an area where it picked up some material for limestone, some calcite, and then deposited it in that sand matrix, it's going to be there. It can harden and make a very tough area in the Coconino. The next thing is what I discovered, which is the parabolic recumbent folds. On the lower left, you'll see some drawings done by Allen and Banks, secular researchers who have done a lot of comparing of sand deposition and sand deposition in water and in air. And they show 3 types of folding or jointing in sand dunes and underwater sand waves. The first type is top one there is type 1. You can see it makes a nice parabolic recumbent fold. Parabolic, it's in the shape of a parabola. Recumbent, it's laying on its side. And they can be from 10 centimeters to 5 meters in height. A type 2, it's trying to form a parabola, but just doesn't have the oomph to do it. And that can be in a layer that's 10 centimeters to 5 meters tall also. Type 3, which we never find in the Coconino, but we do find in sand dunes, is just kind of jointing and cracking and kind of messed up strata without making a real pattern per se. And it can be 10 to 25 centimeters tall. So up to 6 or 8 inches tall. versus the 5 meters for the other. And the 5 meter ones are found in sand waves. So we take a look in the Coconino at a couple of the outcrops that I found. The top one is a 5 meter tall, beautifully formed type 1 parabolic fold. The second one is a type 2 fold, and you're looking at about a meter of height in that one. But we have these nice folds that are only found in sand waves, not found in sand dunes. Now, there's a process involved here that's important, and it's called evulsion. And it's maybe something you've never heard before. You see evulsion at the beach. When you watch a wave roll in, it's picking up some sand in the water. It gets to the top and stops moving. It drops the sand, and then the water recedes, and you'll watch that a few feet after the edge of the water, the sand changes color. And that's because of evulsion. What happens is, as it gets deposited, there's water between all of the sand grains. And in the drawing, the photograph I have there, the black would represent the water. Once it gets deposited and settles down, the weight of the grains themselves squeeze the water out so that you don't have water between the grains. They're touching each other, and you only have water within the pore space. So here we have on a thin section where the blue is where water could be in there after it's been deposited and evulsion occurs. The water gets squeezed out. Most of the water gets squeezed out. And when you watch a wave recede and then you watch that color change recede 4 or 5 feet behind it, that's because evulsion has put out the water and now it's compressed down. Now, something important there. If the water is still between the grains and something tries to fold the sediment, such as in a parabolic fold, if the water is still there, you'll get a nice smooth fold. All the stratolines that are in there will be nice and smooth. But if evulsion has occurred, then the grains are running into each other, they're grabbing each other, and they're tumbling each other, and you don't get that nice smooth stratoline. You get a crumbly stratoline. And in the parabolic folds that we have nice smooth lines at the top and the bottom, which means 20 feet, 5 meters of sandstone was deposited. It was folded into this shape before evulsion could occur at the bottom and cause the stratolines to be tumbling instead of nice and smooth, which means that folding, the bottom being deposited and the top being deposited, the difference there could only be a few minutes at most. Otherwise, evulsion would start to occur at the bottom. So we're looking at something there that is deposited in just a few minutes. By the naturalist thinking, 20 feet of Coconino deposition would probably take somewhere around 500,000 to 1,000,000 years. But it had to happen in seconds. Otherwise, we would not get those nice, smooth stratolines. Now, let's see how this happens. Edwin McKee, the famous geologist of the Coconino, the Colorado Plateau, came up with several ways he thought that perhaps this could happen. And he did some experiments at the University of Minnesota and actually demonstrated the method that we think is the reason that it happened. And it's called a change in flow regime, a fancy term worth a quarter at least to explain a 5-cent thing that happens, which basically the change in flow regime means the water got deeper, or the water got more shallow, or it sped up, or it slowed down, or the sand load increased, or the sand load decreased. Something changed. That's all it means. Something in that flow changed. And what happens when that occurs is let's run this out as I'll take off the horizontal line that showed the bed, the edge of the bed, and we'll start a sediment flow coming across here. Now notice that there's kind of a blue stripe under that flow because the very weight of that flow is causing evulsion at the head of the flow. So you'll see a little speck of blue kind of building up in front of that sediment flow that's coming across, the white blob. And then that layer of water ends up being under that flow, and you end up with a frictionless or laminar flow. And that's why we get such flat surfaces between these beds, because they aren't chewing into each other. One gets deposited and it still has some water at the top because it's happening very rapidly. And then the new flow comes along and they don't interact with each other. But McKee thought that if there was something that happened in the flow regime, it could disrupt that laminar flow. And now as this goes across that area that I've shown in white, and I'm not that good at making animation, so boom, I'm gonna show what happens at the end here. It grabs the top of the crossbed and folds it over back over on top of itself. So it got folded. It had to be deposited rapidly, and then it got folded by the next layer to come across. Pretty amazing. So that's how it gets folded. And we're using McKee's idea for this. It's not something we came up with. We read about it. Now, what happens at the beginning of the fold and the end of the fold? You can see there's a big void at one end, and they're getting compressed into each other at the other end. Well, what happens is crazy stuff. You can see here that it's hard to make any sense of what's going on with all of these folds here, but this is actually in a layer about 1 to 1.5 meters thick that stretches over a distance of about 200 meters. And it's all just convoluted rock like that for that whole distance. Now, when that happens and we get that folding like that, a lot of times there's a flat layer of strata on top of it. You can kind of see that off to the right there, it's kind of a flat layer that's on top of the curved layer or the folded layer. And that would represent a change in flow regime, that it went from cross-bedded to flat. Most of the outcrops that we find, the next layer up has been eroded away. And in fact, in this shot, you can see at the top right where the strata is folding and it's become vertical, but the rest of it's been eroded away. We don't know for sure what it looks like, but it's the beginning of a parabolic recumbent fold. But most of the time, we don't have the next layer up. We don't know what it looks like. But when we do find it and we find the next layer up, it's always flat. Here's another one. The layer on top is flat. Something has changed in the flow regime, so it's gone from cross-bedding to flat-bedded. Here's one. This is a type 2, about 1 meter tall. And you can see there's a nice flat bed on top of it. And here's some of that crazy stuff that can occur again. This is the first fold that I found. You can see it's not real well formed, but it's trying to curve over on top of itself, and a lot of it's eroded away from the side. But this, when I showed John what I'm going to show you next, he looked at it and said, okay, and I also want you to find this. So I started looking for folds. And over the next, I suppose, 4 years, every time I took a hike, I went somewhere in the Coconino. And there's like 375 square kilometers around here where you can get into the Coconino. So it's a lot of hikes, but a lot of it was bushwhacking. But I think I found about all of the outcrops. This is what I found that got John's interest. We did not know what these are. In 2011, we went to the Geological Society of America meeting. John goes every year. I went that year. It was in Minneapolis that year, 2011. And we had a big poster display one day, and we showed photographs of these slits, these vertical slits. That's what I found. They go for about a quarter of a mile, and every 30 inches, you find one of these slits. The slits are about a foot tall. And John did not know what they were. But when we had our display, our presentation at the GSA, we had several people come up and immediately say, "Oh, those are water escape features." Okay, well, several of them said it right away. Said, "Well, how do you know that?" He says, I'm a structural geologist, and that's what we study, is things like water escape features." What that means is there was water. This was wet sediment, still saturated with water. The grains still at least somewhat separated from each other because there's still so much water in it. And an earthquake occurs. And when that earthquake occurs, it shakes and tries to separate the water from the grains. And when it does that, the water has to go somewhere. It has to escape. And what it did here is it escaped horizontally in these slits. And you'll notice there's also a little bit of folding at the bottom, and that folding looks more like earthquake folding than depositional folding. All of those slits, we stuck a piece of paper back into it. It's actually a void, and then measured the angle relative to magnetic north, and all of the slits go in the same direction. And that's kind of cool stuff. And started looking for slits around Sedona. That was part of my hikings into the Coconino. Here, it's a telephoto picture because the slits are about 400 feet up a sheer cliff. But here are some slits in the Coconino that are about a half a mile from the slits that I first showed you, due east. And this is my favorite photograph of them because at the far right upper corner, you see a slit that goes through two beds. That's significant. That means both of those beds were still saturated with water when the earthquake hit. And one slit goes through two beds. That's just more indication that this stuff gets deposited. It's wet, and a lot of it is getting deposited before it even has a chance to evolve the water out of it. Another cool thing about it is we knew what water pipes are. And water pipes, and there are quite a few around Sedona, you're walking along a flat surface and you see a place where the strata basically goes into a circle shape. And it's concentric circles as if the water was flowing up or down through the rock at that point instead of horizontal. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. An earthquake occurs and the water tries to escape. And when it does, it goes straight up because that's the path of least resistance. When they go horizontal, like we see here, that's the path of least resistance, which tells you there's a tremendous amount of strata on top of this so that the water doesn't go up, it goes horizontal to try to escape. So we're adding even more strata, more layers that had to be saturated with water when this occurred, when this earthquake occurred and this escaped. We find the same thing in the Schnebly Hill Formation. I found lots of outcrops of this in the Schnebly Hill Formation. And then we can go one step further with the water escape. If you look at this, you'll see this is kind of checkerboarded. I'll go to the next one because you can see it a little bit better. Notice that you have very distinct horizontal and dipped lines, and you have some vertical lines in it. Those are water escape lines. And here we'll get close up. This is in Secret Canyon. Notice the vertical lines that are in this. Some of you may have heard of Checkerboard Mesa at the eastern entrance of Zion National Park. And those are water escape features. The naturalists have no idea. They can't explain checkerboard mesa, they just say, well, it's erosional. And yes, it is erosional. But how did those vertical slits get in there? Checkerboard mesa has nothing on Sedona. In Sedona, there's one place on Bear Mountain in the Coconino where it is checkerboard from the bottom to the top, 500 feet vertical of checkerboarding. And here you can actually walk on it. You can see those vertical slits as well as horizontal slits. And notice where the green arrow is pointing. That is pointing to a water escape feature also, only this time it's a water pipe. And that's the way we usually find them, is in water pipes. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's actually quite a few of those water pipes in the Coconino here. Earthquake has moved a lot of water through there and really messed up the strata. And it was all underground when that occurred. This is before erosion occurred to haul away the sediments that were hiding this from our view. A final thing to show is desiccation cracks and ripples. Desiccation occurs usually in a mudstone, something that has a lot of clay-sized particles in it. It's where, as the material dried out, it shrunk and it leaves these cracks. This actually occurred deep inside the Coconino as it was curling, as it was drying out. A lot of times you'll see desiccation cracks on the surface and the clay will be curled up where you see it. And on the right are ripple effects. These are things that you could find in sand dunes, but you can also find it in sand waves. The desiccation cracks almost have to be in sand waves, water deposited. Okay, and one final thing, and that's muscovite flakes. These are shiny flakes. On the right, you can see it's a little bit fuzzy, but when you go to the seashore and the sand reflects back up at you, it's actually reflecting off of these little muscovite flakes. And you can see on the left kind of a turquoise flake that goes all the way from the bottom left corner to the upper right corner, and you see the grains that are around it. Now, the question is, do you find those muscovite plates in sand waves or sand dunes? Well, one of John Whitmore's students at Cedarville College did an experiment. He took some Coconino sandstone and he broke it up into particles, sand particles, broke it into its individual pieces, did so in such a way as to not mess up the muscovite. And so he could still see muscovite flakes in there. He put it in this pickle jar, put a propeller up at the top to blow the sand around. And in 4 days, he could not find any muscovite. It had been ground down so fine that you couldn't find it in just 4 days. So it doesn't sound like these flakes could be transported in air very well. Well, what about water? He used the same pickle jar, put water in there with coconino that was ground up just like before, and after a year could still find small muscovite flakes in there, which tells us that the coconino was transported in water. So that's the latest findings in the coconino. I think we have a solid case for the coconino being deposited in water. And I think because of the checkerboarding and the recumbent folds that we find, that we can show that it was deposited, the entire coconino was probably deposited in minutes, certainly less than an hour, in order to end up being able to do or to get formed the way it was by earthquakes and by the deposition process itself. So with that, I'm done. Are there any tours that show these features?
Yes.
No. All the tours around town are just down at the level of Sedona. The bottom of the Coconino is 1,000 feet up, and we're at high altitude, so it's a pretty vigorous hike just to get to the close ones. The one thing you can see is that really huge fold that I showed recumbent fold. You can see that from the ground. It is visible. And it's the only one that's visible from the lower elevations. But of course, you have to look at it through a telescope or a long angle lens or something like that.
Has the formation been tested outside of Arizona?
What do you mean by tested?
The way that you did. To find the features you did.
They're probably not going to find those features because they're only found in cross bedding, and they tend to be very localized. And since most of the other areas, like the Glorieta and other areas, they're generally flat bedded. So you're not going to find the folds. I suspect there's probably checkerboarding out there somewhere. I just got lucky in finding it around Sedona, but I also have evidence of a major earthquake in Sedona. Where those horizontal slits are is an area about a half a kilometer square of just all kinds of distorted strata, about 40 feet thick, from an earthquake. And I find effects of that earthquake radiating out from the center, which is typical. So it's a unique set of circumstances in Sedona.
How do you distinguish Coconino sandstone from other sandstones?
Well, the way that's done for just about any layer is you look at the layer above and the layer below. Do I find, a hermit Coconino toroweep? Toroweep's what's on top of the Coconino at the Grand Canyon and here in Sedona. If I go elsewhere, do I find those layers, same appearing layers together? And the answer is yes. And that's how we have found out that these are all related. It's not just that, ooh, I found a layer of sandstone here and a layer of sandstone there. I've not only found that layer of sandstone, I've also found the layers above and the layers below, and possibly several layers above and below that are exactly the same. Well, you're not going to get exactly the same over a large area unless it's the same deposition.
Why are they so dead set against it forming underwater?
Because they would then have to admit that we were correct and they weren't. And they have the Coconino, you don't see it unless you're involved in the geology of it and researching it. But it is just when we did our poster section the second year we went to the GSA when it was in South Carolina, we had a poster session, and one of the first people to come up with it was, you don't know what you're doing. That can't be Coconino because Coconino can't do that. And we got we got some positive comments, people that found it really interesting. A couple of people have said, well, that kind of kills the whole idea of the Coconino being wind deposited. But your ardent atheists simply will not concede, period. They just won't talk about it.
Are those layers above and below the Coconino different in composition?
Are the layers?
Yes, the hermit is a mudstone, so the particles are much finer. It's not really nearly as well cemented. That's at the Grand Canyon that the hermit's underneath. In Sedona, the Schnebly Hill is underneath the Coconino. Excuse me. And we did some thin sections of the Schnebly Hill and found that the only difference was color. The Schnebly Hill has gone through some iron-rich water as it was being transported, and so there is a thin layer of iron on the outside of the grains, which gives it the red color. And most of the sandstones in the Southwest, that's the reason that they're that color. And we believe that the Schnebly Hill is actually part of the Coconino. It's just that part of it went through a different area of water and picked up the iron coatings. The Toroweep up above, I've actually found layers that look like Schnebly Hill within the Toroweep above the Coconino. The Toroweep's kind of a messed up layer. it has three members, and rather than being vertically related, they're horizontally related, and it changes its appearance in those three different areas quite a bit, even though it's one formation.
Is the sandstone found in other continents?
Oh, yes. Sandstone, about 20 to 25% of all strata is sandstone, and it's found throughout the world. And in fact, if you look at Tim Clary's work on deposition of what is known as mega sequences around the world, you go around the world and you will find a layer that is probably the Coconino on every continent. If you really want to get into the nitty gritty of that, get Tim Clary's book from the Institute for Creation Research called Carved in Stone. It's an expensive book, but it's hardback and it's full color. And it gets into the nitty gritty.
How has the community responded to your newsletter that you send out?
Well, in the beginning, I got positive and negative, as you might expect. I don't get many comments now. I've been called the most evil man in Sedona. I've been called worse than a pornographer. I've been told that somebody was going to take me to court and get the newsletter stopped. It was going to go to the post office and get it stopped. Of course, you can't, freedom of the press. But I also get very positive comments, and a lot of them from non-believers that just find it all very interesting. I even had one New Age person say, I don't believe, I'm not going to become a creationist, but I think you're right. I don't know how you do that, but so I get lots of interesting comments.
Sedona is a hotbed of New Age, is that true?
And atheism. There are a lot of atheists in Sedona. But yes, it is the New Age Mecca for sure. Lots of shops around town that have crystals and rocks, and you can take a tour to go to all the vortexes where psychic energy supposedly comes out.
Have any of the animal tracks been identified?
No, because amphibian reptiles, their feet are very, very similar, and you're not going to get a real sharp cast most of the time, especially if they're fighting a current at the same time. They're going to be pushing to the side, not just straight down. So no, and that's why they'll even say these tracks are either reptilian or amphibian. They don't even know which one because their feet are so similar.
I wish I heard your lecture 65 years ago.
Yeah.
What were you saying 65 years ago?
Me 65 years ago, I was just learning my ABCs.
I take a course in geology then.
So the audience member said he was taking geology then.
Oh, wow.
And
No, I was still in elementary school.
Is there a relationship between the name of his ministry, Crying Rocks? Is it related to the water moving up through the rocks? Is that why it's called Crying Rocks Ministry?
We call it Crying Rocks because Jesus said, if I silence the people, the rocks will cry out.
Okay.
And we put that on the front of every newsletter.
Did he cover when that probably happened or when he thinks the earthquake happened to cause that?
the timing of these various earthquakes.
I believe the earthquake occurred somewhere around halfway through the flood. It's you can kind of get sequential, but you can't really hit times. It all had to happen so fast. I'm talking about a layer, maybe a couple layers come in through a mega sequence of 3 layers, a limestone on the bottom, or excuse me, a sandstone on the bottom, a mudstone in the middle, and a limestone on top. But then there may be a pause there of a few days before the next 3 layers come in. But you're depositing very thick layers each time, and you're doing the whole thing in probably 150 days.
Would you say that the formation is revealed in Genesis when it says that the waters assuaged. So that's the idea that the waters came in and they came back out, and then they came in, but they went out a little bit farther because they were receding after the flood.
Tim Clary gets into that. But it's again, it's do they keep coming in and then eventually go out, or do they come in and go out a little bit? I think there's a whole mix in there of every possibility. Some of them coming in and then immediately followed by another coming in. I think they were all of these layers were deposited because of tsunamis that literally went clear across the continent. Steve Austin first explored that idea in his book, Grand Canyon Monument to the Flood, back in the early 90s, just when mega sequences were first being considered as a possibility.
It would be an accurate testimony of the scriptures saying when the waters assuaged, and then the rocks would be testifying to that because of the formation that the assuaging.
Yes, and we believe that the water it could do some receding along the way, but it basically built up. And surprisingly, the naturalists believe the same thing. We both believe that the layers were deposited higher and higher because sea level went up. We just believe that it really wasn't sea level going up as much as tsunamis sweeping across, which then, of course, ended up meaning that sea level was higher because you had all the stuff from that tsunami now on top of the continents.
So all these interesting things happened out west, and then we just got flat here in Minnesota.
Yeah, if the sea waters were salty, would there be evidence of that found somewhere in some of the layers of rocks? And are the wells, all the wells don't have salt in them when you drill a well. So where did the salt go?
I think a lot of the salt was actually washed into the oceans as the flood receded, that the water coming in was not so salty. For one thing, we find secrets. They don't, another thing the naturalist doesn't tell you, for example, a dinosaur national monument, they tell you all about the dinosaur bones. What they don't tell you is that all through all of that are clams. And they will say, well, they were freshwater clams because Dinosaur National Monument is pretty far from the ocean. We believe, of course, the clams were swept in from the ocean. But you don't really, I mean, I'm sure I can't say for certain, I haven't seen it written or anything, but I'm assuming that they're checking to see if there's any salt in the dirt or rock matrix where they're finding the fossils. But of course, sharks have been found with dinosaur bones also, and they say, well, these were freshwater sharks, which tends to make me think then the oceans were kind of freshwater at before the flood also. And that as the water drained off, it dissolved salts and washed them into the ocean.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.